Welcome to Mostly Minutia. I'm Colleen Lindell, and this is episode 46, Essential. Since the diagnosis of our worldwide pandemic, I've found myself desiring to hear from the frontline workers. Most specifically, my curiosity about the grocer has increased, since I think least of all did they expect they were signing up for a frontline position. And then boom, overnight, they've become as essential as an aid worker. This is an interview I did March 26th, just a few weeks ago, with a friend of mine, Ben Dederich. Ben works at a grocery co-op in Madison, Wisconsin. The neighborhood where the co-op is located is composed of middle to upper middle class white families, millennials, and Gen Z folks. Since established in 1974, it's fair to say the co-op is a neighborhood institution. Anybody who lives in the neighborhood shops there. The market is a medium-sized store in a building that used to belong to the Elks Club. The space is a little tight, but everyone's used to it, and they make do. Ben is a clerk there and splits his time between the produce department and health and wellness. Also, Ben is married, he loves cats, and he's a musician. Here's Ben. I wanted you to share with the listener what you've kind of seen in the last 3 weeks transpire.
Sure.
And I'm wondering if we could start with just when you noticed, what was your first inclination that maybe something had shifted in the emotional atmosphere of your clientele?
Sure. So about 3 weeks ago, we started to have a hard time keeping hand sanitizer, antibacterial soaps, and toilet paper in stock. And there was an increased interest in vitamin C and zinc. And at first, it wasn't too intense, but after about a week, it started to become difficult to keep those things stocked. They started to become harder to acquire from distributors and vendors. And the demand for those things started to become more insistent. I guess the tone of customers' inquiries after those things started to become more and more tense and anxious as it became increasingly clear that COVID-19 was actually a serious issue, and especially around the time that it was declared a pandemic, which was at the 11th? I think? Around that time, there was that dynamic sharply peaked, and for honestly, the last couple of weeks after that, we've had a really hard time stocking those things, and the volume in the store around that time peaked profoundly. In fact, on that Friday, it was Friday the 13th, all of our stores set all-time sales records. And even, so not just in the health and wellness department, but also working in produce, and when I would go around to other parts of the store, it looks a bit like when you think about the stereotype of the 40s and 50s, Soviet supply store images where there's nothing on the shelves and there's just one sad little can of cobwebby, I don't know, canned cabbage or something sad like that. It wasn't quite that bad. I'm exaggerating a little bit. But there was so much that was out of stock. There was just wall-to-wall people. And because of the narrow dimensions of the retail space, there's just crowds of people up in my grill at all times. And that's fairly normal for a weekend. A lot of people aren't super mindful of personal space. And even if they are, it's really difficult to avoid being in somebody else's personal bubble when it's busy there.
Mm-hmm.
I would say it peaked for about a week after that. Like I would say for a full week from the time that the virus was declared a pandemic, it was incredibly busy. I think the following week after that initial declaration, the store implemented a system where they would have like a bouncer at the front door that kept account of how many people were in the store and would only allow there to be 50 people in the building at one time. And if I'm not mistaken, that's in compliance with our local government's ordinance and mandate.
Mm-hmm.
So that's good. However, like I said, since it's a small space, even having just 50 people in the store, it still feels busy. Granted, less so than what it would otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe some of the hoarding that you experienced? I know you've talked a little bit about it on Facebook.
Yeah. To me, it seems that throughout the course of this pandemic, because it's unprecedented, at least for the generations that are currently living, I think that folks really haven't had like a clear expectation of how this is going to work and how we're responding to it and like what is really necessary. And so, like I mentioned, toilet paper has been very difficult to keep in stock. Canned goods, so the aisles that are dedicated to canned and packaged goods looked like the plague of Egypt had hit them for a while. There was just like very little on the shelves. Since then, they've been able to replenish those stocks, but yet, so people are getting like canned soup and pasta, anything non-perishable that they could carry.
Mm-hmm.
And on one hand, to me, it seems a little bit excessive and a little bit like panic hoarding, but folks don't know. Nobody has a clear expectation of whether or not a quarantine or like a lockdown measures were going to be mandated, and if so, what those would look like.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, like we know that groceries are considered an essential service, so we're going to remain open. And in our state, our governor recently mandated a safer at home measure, which just means that other than obtaining essential services, which includes a fairly wide range of reasonable things, ranging from groceries to auto service, like repairs, like medication, etc. Those things are all permissible, but it seemed like folks really weren't certain what they were going to have access to, and so it seemed like people were panicking and trying to like almost doomsday prep a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think started the whole TP hoarding?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess that wouldn't be the first thing that I would think of because it's thought of as an essential product. I think people were assuming that maybe they were going to be on like a shelter-in-place type lockdown or some situation where they can't leave their houses for months, or who knows, maybe this is doomsday and maybe we're all going to be trapped in a bunker underground for the foreseeable future. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to know if the clientele that was coming through on March 13th, like if you noticed, were they transferring their anxieties to you?
Yeah. It's kind of difficult when you're in close proximity with a huge crowd of people and everybody's nervous and anxious. It's hard not to be psychologically receptive to that. And for some of us, just being in a big crowd of people where there's strangers in your personal space, that in and of itself can be kind of a stressor.
Yeah.
And when the anxiety and the fear is palpable on people, that amplifies it significantly.
Mm-hmm. Were you being treated well?
For the most part, it's sometimes kind of common in this. I should be careful about what I say, but the kind of clientele that tends to shop at health food stores tends to be more affluent than the average American, and I think in part because of that, they tend to have high expectations of the goods and services that are available to them, sometimes unreasonably so. So we would have customers complaining about things being out of stock and not understanding, or especially when the things that they're complaining about being out of stock were non-essentials. Like somebody was upset that we were out of tamarind paste, and I'm like, it's tamarind. It's not rice. It's not beans. It's not an essential thing that you need to survive. Or like somebody was upset that we were out of gluten-free chocolate chip cookies. Like, really? And to be fair, like, I think people reach for comfort and familiarity, and I think that luxury and pleasure can definitely be a valid source of comfort.
Mm-hmm.
Most people were reasonable, but there are some folks that were very unreasonable about non-essential things, I guess is the concise way to say it.
Ben, what has your produce section been looking like? Like with all of the, a lot of these packaged goods just jumping off the shelves, what has the fresh food atmosphere been like?
It's been, well, for that initial first week, it was difficult to keep ginger and garlic in stock because those things have some antimicrobial and immune supporting properties. It seemed like a lot of folks were buying those en masse, also onions. Yeah, lots of things were actually selling out for that first week. Normally what I do is I survey my section and see what needs to be stocked, and then I make a list of everything, go back, fill a big cart up with produce crates, and then push it out and stock from there. But what I started doing instead was, because we were running out of so much stuff in our back stock, just keeping a list of what we had on hand in back stock, comparing that to what I could reasonably fit out onto the floor, which is unusual. I've never had to do that before. There were some days where everything was overabundant and nobody was shopping, and now it's been very start-stop and very destabilizing to the normal like flow of goods, I guess.
And how have you been feeling with, you're totally on the front lines of this entire thing. And I think it's so crazy. I'm just trying to put myself in the shoes of the grocer and imagining somebody getting a job working at a grocery store is, a means to an end and also low stress. And, like, boom, you wake up one day and you're like this essential frontlines person next to a medical worker. How does that make you feel?
It's strange when somebody signs up for another occupation that is considered essential to like protecting the welfare of individuals in society, like a healthcare worker, a firefighter, a police officer, a soldier, like those sorts of things. Folks go into those occupations knowing full well the risks to their own health and well-being. You don't think when you sign up for a job stocking produce that like, oh, this could potentially be risking my life. Like nobody thinks that. And so that thought and that reality has been a primary stressor for me. By the time I realized exactly how serious the COVID-19 pandemic was, at the same time it dawned on me that I had likely already been exposed to the virus just based on the sheer volume of people that I work in close proximity with. I'm breathing their air. It's normal for, like, while I'm stocking produce, especially, I have customers come up right behind me or literally right next to me within like a 3-foot or less bubble of my space. And folks were still doing that. And I don't think that the importance of social distancing maybe had been quite hammered home by the powers that be or by media. That was a significant stressor. Also, like I mentioned before, since this is sort of unprecedented, a lot of folks in the position of making decisions on how to respond to this don't really have a template to work from. And so management it had like plexiglass barriers installed at the checkout lanes to protect the cashiers. And to me, I really wish that would have been done a couple of weeks ago, like immediately. Or for a limitation on the number of customers allowed into the store. I wish that would have been done sooner. But
I just feel like I don't think any of us understood how this was going to descend upon us so quickly. I don't know. You speak to that though. Tell me what your thought is about that.
Well, I had been deliberately avoiding the news cycle and social media for about a month, just because it had been already stressful and adding to my own generalized anxiety. And so I was sort of oblivious. Like, I was vaguely aware that COVID-19 had been an issue, but the last I had heard, it was in other countries. And because I had lived through, there was the swine flu epidemic and SARS. I actually was traveling in Southeast Asia during the SARS epidemic in 2003. So to me, it just seemed like it was going to be another one of those things that gets hyped up for a bit and then blows over. So once I realized that this was actually a serious situation that was going to be affecting us in the United States directly, I started paying closer attention to the news cycle, and specifically the countries that had been hit the hardest and had suffered the worst casualties from it, such as Italy and Iran and China, versus the countries that had responded differently, such as Japan and Singapore, and experienced significantly fewer casualties and effectively flattened their curve much sooner. And so with that in mind, I am hoping that the powers that be in our country, both government and otherwise, will take wisely drastic measures sooner rather than later. My feeling has been that we have dragged our feet for too long, and most of the measures that I'm seeing implemented both on a local and personal level, but also nationwide, they seem like they might be too little too late, and I hope that I'm wrong about that. But I'm concerned about what we're doing and how late we're doing it.
Can you talk about the stress that you've been feeling, and what kind of measures are you taking to protect yourself?
Well, I'm washing my hands with hot water for at least half a minute and antibacterial soap. Carry hand sanitizer. When I'm at work, I wear disposable nitrile gloves. I have a former coworker that offered to make cotton surgical masks. I've heard different information about what masks actually do to protect a person. According to, I think, the Surgeon General, they don't effectively protect from the transmission of viruses. They have to be a much more specialized kind of mask. But I've also read information saying that they can potentially reduce the microns that you inhale. So anyway, a former coworker, has offered to make cotton masks for us, and whether or not that'll protect me, I don't know. But I think if nothing else, it'll serve as a visual cue to remind the public of the pandemic and the necessity for social distancing. So, like I said earlier, I think it's highly likely that I've already been exposed. I'm not symptomatic. I feel fine. And at this point, because part of my livelihood and my access to healthcare depends on being employed, I feel like I don't really have much of a choice. I mean, I have thought very, very soberly about, like, should I quit this job in order to protect myself? But that's a thought that I return to on a daily basis. I'm constantly trying to gauge the atmosphere and paying attention to the news cycle and asking my intuition and trying to use my best judgment to determine whether this is still like a safe environment and should I stay here or should I save my hide and bail. So far, I think that it's in my best interest to stay in the job, but it's really difficult to be in that kind of position where you have to choose between your livelihood and your access to healthcare and being exposed to a potentially lethal virus. And So I have these moments of stress and panic around the feelings around that. And then eventually I just reach a point where I'm like, well, screw it. It's kind of out of my hands. So I might as well not worry about it and keep trucking. And it seems like a lot of my coworkers have gone through similar cycles on a daily basis where they just feel overwhelmed and panicky, and we feel like the world might actually be ending. And then eventually we level out and choose to just keep soldiering on.
Yeah. The ebb and the flow of the mind, huh? Have you noticed since March 13th and now, current day, March 26th, have you noticed a difference in the way the customers are?
Yes. Just as of this week, it seems that most individuals are being much more cautious about social distancing.
Mm-hmm.
They're being more wary. I see more people wearing gloves and a lot more people wearing face masks. And people just seem more cautious, and their demeanor, their energy, if you will, seems less panicked and more fearful.
Okay. From panic to fear.
Mm-hmm.
And that's interesting that those two are different things.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're different versions of the same thing, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
They seem less like they're stampeding out of panic and more like they're like a defensive, self-protective sort of posture.
Okay. So it's stabilized fear.
Yeah.
No, I don't. Are customers being kind to you, even though they're feeling fearful?
Yeah, generally, yes. With the exceptions that I mentioned earlier, of people throwing fits about their gluten-free treats being out of stock.
Mm-hmm.
I've had a number of people thank me for working, which sometimes I'm receptive to and sometimes I'm not. I know last week I was feeling a lot of intense anxiety and stress and uncertainty and feeling kind of resentful, feeling very resentful about feeling like I need to choose between my livelihood and access to healthcare and being exposed to a contagion. And I really didn't want people's thanks. It felt, and I know that it wasn't intended this way, but it felt patronizing. Like, I'm glad you're grateful that I'm here, Deborah, but I don't really have a choice. And you being here is literally risking my life, so save your thanks. This week, though, since I've sort of come to a place of acceptance that, like, this is the way things are, I guess, I'm a little bit more receptive to people saying thanks.
What would you rather have people do right now? Like, if you could order things the way that you could order them, how would you like for it to be?
I would like for the number of people allowed in our retail space to be limited. I would, this is going to sound crazy, but like have face shields for all employees.
Mm-hmm.
I would prefer that our customers significantly consolidate their grocery shopping and plan ahead. I would prefer that people limit their visits to our store to one per week and just stock up what they need. One frustration that many of us have shared is that there are still people coming in, just to get a muffin and a coffee in the morning, look at the paper, and they're stopping to like socialize with their neighbors that they meet. And I want people to be aware that in a very real way, when you make these visits, you are risking your own health and my health and potentially the integrity of our healthcare system and by extension, our society. And I know that might sound like overreaction to some folks. I'm seeing lots of people on social media saying, oh, everybody's just overreacting. Like, this is just like the flu. And sure, some people might die, but people die from the flu. But that's not what we're seeing in some other countries where they have not been careful about the way that they do these things. So yeah, I want people to make those visits treating them as a calculated risk and to do it mindfully.
Thanks, Ben. That's really good.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's over. I mean, just personally, I don't think that's overreactive. I feel like that's responsive.
Thank you.
Ben, I just want to thank you for your time, for spending right before your shift today, spending about an hour with me.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Maybe we can have a little follow-up in the future?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Since this recording, Ben is still working at the co-op. He and his coworkers are now wearing homemade masks, and customers have become more aware of social distancing. Also, Ben has started to receive hazard pay. Music in this episode by Chris Zabriskie off the album I Made This While You Were Asleep. This track is called I'm About to Do the Second Hardest Thing I've Ever Done. You can find this album and all of Chris's albums wherever you stream your music or at chriszabriskie.com. Thank you to Ben for kindly sharing his thoughts and feelings regarding his current situation. If you know of a grocer or any frontline worker who would appreciate a platform to share their story, please refer them to me via my Instagram, at Colleen Lindell or at Mostly Minutia Podcast. You can find links to all of these as well as Chris Zabriskie's music in this episode's show notes, which you can find right now wherever you're currently streaming. Cover art for Mostly Minutia by Eva Fan. You can find everything ponderful and whimsical and fantastical by Eva at evafan.com. Until next time, keep taking care of you. If you're a frontline worker, please know I'm continuously praying blessing and protection over you. We are all so thankful and grateful for you, and I'm doing my best to stay out of your hair and hopefully keep others out of your hair too by staying at home.